For more than 3 centuries, the British Empire stretched across oceans and continents. It influenced trade, politics, culture, and war. But it also shaped something deeper. Something invisible. Something carried in hearts, minds, and memories. From the 1700s to the mid-1900s, empire shaped how British people saw themselves. It built a belief in destiny, pride, and responsibility. It shaped what it meant to be British at home and what it meant to be British abroad. Through schools, newspapers, wars, and daily life, the empire became a mirror in which Britain saw its own reflection. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for giving your time to this journey into history. Today, we look not just at borders and battles, but at the ideas that lived inside people. Ideas that changed how Britain thought of itself. Ideas that still echo in the modern world. Empire created pride. Empire created certainty. Empire created questions that would one day become cracks. Before we begin, here is a question for you. Do you think British identity would have developed the same way without an empire, or was empire the foundation of the national personality? In the early 18th century, Britain was still discovering what it would become. Between 1700 and 1760, it was not yet a global superpower, but the foundations of that identity were beginning to form. Trade expanded. Naval fleets guarded sea routes. Early colonial ventures created footholds overseas. These developments were not yet an empire in the form history would later recognize, but they inspired an ambition that echoed through daily life. A belief took shape that Britain was different, that it had a future beyond its shores. This belief did not arrive suddenly. In marketplaces, spices, fabrics, and imported materials appeared in small quantities. In coffeehouses, merchants traced imaginary routes on worn maps and spoke of opportunities that lay across the ocean. Rumor and speculation created the first outlines of a global vision. Long before policy or conquest solidified it. At home, identity began to shift. People started to speak of Britain not only as a nation, but as a rising force. They compared themselves to rival states. They measured progress by shipbuilding, trade agreements, and military readiness. Naval strength became a point of pride, even for those who had never seen the sea. The idea of the island as secure, capable, and advancing outward slowly became part of public imagination. Confidence grew from possibility rather than outcome. Newspapers strengthened this emerging belief. Reports from overseas trading posts and coastal settlements reached readers. These articles were often brief, incomplete, or speculative. But they suggested that the world was changing. And that Britain was part of that change. They did not need to describe power directly. They only needed to imply direction. Each new outpost, each secured port, each commercial treaty hinted at momentum. In these years, the country did not present itself as dominant. It presented itself as destined. That distinction mattered. Destiny implied patience. It implied preparation. It implied that the future was waiting. This sense of expectation shaped how people interpreted news from abroad. Victories seemed like signs. Losses seemed like setbacks on a longer path. The idea of a special future began to outweigh the present reality. Class also influenced this early sense of identity. For the upper classes, overseas ventures reinforced social authority. Trade and investment promised new forms of wealth. The aristocracy saw expansion as validation of leadership. The growing middle class saw opportunity in the machinery of commerce. They imagined futures shaped by contracts, finance, and international exchange. For working people, identity formed more quietly. They saw imported goods in shops and ships in harbors. And they sensed that the world was changing, even if they were not invited to shape that change directly. Over time, these impressions became habits of thought. Britain and the wider world were no longer separate. They were connected through trade routes, rumors, and imagination. Conversations about the future included distant ports. Children grew up hearing stories of foreign lands before they understood where those lands were. Ambition became something learned, not declared. Identity took root through repetition rather than instruction. The Navy played a crucial role in this transformation. It was more than a military force. It was a symbol of national presence. Ships sailing into foreign waters represented more than power. They represented reach. They allowed people at home to believe that the island mattered elsewhere. Each success confirmed the idea that the future lay outward. Each failure reinforced the belief that stronger efforts were required. Travelers and returning sailors contributed to this sense of identity. They brought stories that blurred fact and interpretation. They described distant markets, ports with unfamiliar customs, and negotiations with rulers. Their words shaped how listeners imagined the world. These accounts created feelings rather than knowledge. They made expansion seem natural, even when it was improvised. The empire that would later exist in law and administration first existed in memory and expectation. Between 1700. The people. They. Of. Movement. This period planted seeds that would later grow into stronger convictions. By the time the century ended, those seeds would support systems of governance, education, and national pride. But at this earlier moment, identity was fluid. It was not yet a claim of greatness. It was a suggestion of potential. It asked people to imagine, not to declare. It encouraged hope more than certainty. Looking back, the foundations of identity during these years reveal how belief can shape history before history confirms it. A nation does not become powerful by action alone. It becomes powerful when its people decide to see themselves as part of something larger. Britannia's early imperial identity did not begin with dominance. It began with curiosity. With the simple idea that the island might matter beyond itself. That idea would one day help justify expansion. It would support decisions that defined the 19th century. It would shape how the empire understood its purpose. But in the first half of the 18th century, it remained a quiet undercurrent. A feeling rather than a command. A seed rather than a structure. And once formed, it guides the course of a nation's future. These early foundations remind us that identity grows long before it is recognized. It takes shape in imagination before it takes shape on maps. And once formed, it guides the course of a nation's future. It becomes habit before it becomes policy. These early foundations remind us that identity grows long before it is recognized. It takes shape in imagination before it takes shape on maps. A seed rather than a structure. And once formed, it guides the course of a nation's future. It becomes habit before it becomes policy. This moment in history, from 1700 to 1760, was the beginning of that journey. Victory and Confidence 1760 to 1800. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain stood at a new threshold of influence. Naval victories, territorial gains, and commercial expansion combined to reshape how the nation saw itself. Ports in North America and the Caribbean, strongholds on the Indian subcontinent, and new maritime routes across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans signaled a shift in global balance. For the first time, many Britons believed that the empire was not only successful, but destined to lead. The end of the war marked the beginning of a cultural transformation that would define the final decades of the 18th century. Newspapers praised the peace agreement as proof of national character. They described victories at sea and on land as evidence that Britain held a natural advantage. Editorials portrayed the Navy as a shield that protected trade, honor, and identity. As these reports circulated, they created a rising wave of confidence. The war had been fought far away, but triumph arrived at home in the form of headlines that stirred imagination. Readers in small towns felt connected to events across continents. They saw themselves as participants in a world where British actions shaped distant outcomes. Coffeehouses became the social engine of that confidence. In crowded rooms filled with the smell of roasted beans, ink, and wet coats drying near the fire, conversations unfolded like informal debates. Men gathered around newspapers, tracing trade routes on maps spread across tables, arguing about policy and opportunity. The names of ports and governors became familiar, even to those who had never left Britain. Discussion carried a sense of inclusion. People felt as though they were witnessing history rather than hearing about it secondhand. Victory gave them permission to imagine influence. This confidence did not remain in public spaces. It flowed into private life. In homes, tea from overseas plantations became a symbol of refinement. Children grew up on stories of naval officers and explorers. Families spoke of the empire as a horizon rather than a boundary. Even daily routines absorbed the sense of triumph. Imported products on dinner tables and fabrics stitched into clothing seemed to confirm that the world was turning in Britannia's direction. Pride settled into ordinary spaces, unannounced but unmistakable. The press played a crucial role in sustaining this shift. Illustrations showed ships cutting across waves with billowing sails, cannons ready but serene. Pamphlets and essays praised victory as the result of discipline and ingenuity. They suggested that the Empyrea's growth was not just fortunate, but deserved. In these narratives, success became synonymous with identity. To be British was to belong to a nation that won. This belief took root with remarkable speed. It appeared in art, where portraits of admirals and generals hung beside depictions of landscapes newly claimed or influenced. It appeared in theater, where plays celebrated the idea of providence and imperial confidence. It appeared in sermons that described peace as a sign of divine favor. The message was not coordinated, but it was consistent. Triumph became a cultural language spoken without instruction. Yet beneath the confidence lay contradictions. Expansion required administration, diplomacy, and financial responsibility. The very victories that inspired celebration also created expectations. Territories acquired in the peace settlement needed governance. Trade required regulation. These complexities did not often reach the public. Newspapers preferred stories that praised success rather than the burdens that accompanied it. Coffeehouse debates rarely focused on cost. Victory was easier to celebrate when its demands were kept out of sight. Still, the idea of destiny grew. Even those without wealth or political influence felt attached to the Empyrea's narrative. A shopkeeper in London selling imported fabrics could see their livelihood as evidence of national reach. Pride moved through society, one purchase, one headline, one conversation at a time. As the 18th century progressed, triumph became memory, and memory became expectation. People assumed future victories would follow past ones. They believed that the Empyrea's path forward would mirror its path behind. Few questioned whether expansion had limits. Few wondered whether circumstances might change. Identity and power became intertwined so tightly that separating them felt impossible. But victory did more than shape pride. It shaped imagination. Children who entered school in the 1770s learned geography with maps shaded to represent influence. They grew into adults who had never experienced a Britain without global presence. For them, maritime dominance and territorial control were not achievements. They were foundations. The empire existed not as a choice, but as a condition of life. By 1800, the world looked different than it had 4 decades earlier. The 7 Years' War remained a memory, but its legacy continued. The confidence that followed victory became part of the national voice. Even as challenges awaited in the century to come. The belief that Britain had a special place in global affairs endured. It shaped how people understood themselves, their country, and their future. This shaped how people understood themselves, their country, and their future. This period reveals how triumph can transform identity. It shows how victories on distant shores can alter the mood of a nation. It shows how pride, once rooted in achievement, can become something deeper. Between 1760 and 1800, success ceased to be an outcome. It became an expectation. And in that expectation, a sense of destiny took hold. The empire had strengthened, and so had the faith that it would continue to do so. Victory created confidence. Confidence created belief. And belief became the quiet force that defined a generation. Schools as identity builders 1800 to 1830. In the early decades of the 19th century, the British Empire was not held together only by soldiers, traders, and administrators. It was held together by classrooms. Across Britain, education became a quiet but powerful institution shaping how children understood the world and their place within it. While factories roared and ships crossed oceans, pencils scratched across paper and young minds absorbed lessons that would outlast the machinery of empire. In these rooms, the next generation learned not only arithmetic and handwriting, but identity. Classrooms of this era were simple in appearance. Wooden desks, ink pots, chalk dust drifting in afternoon light. But on the walls, maps revealed a world arranged by imperial imagination. The color red spread across oceans and continents, marking territories under British rule. To a child, these maps created a sense of scale that felt natural, even inevitable. The empire was not far away. It was on the wall in front of them, surrounding Britain like a halo of global influence. Textbooks reinforced this message with confident certainty. Geography lessons described Britain as a center of progress. History exercises emphasized order, stability, and leadership. Stories of distant lands presented local customs through the lens of comparison, highlighting the supposed benefits of British guidance. Improvement became a repeated idea, a thread woven into every subject. The suggestion was subtle but constant. Britain did not just rule. It helped. In literature classes, reading selections often celebrated explorers, inventors, and naval figures. Their journeys were described as triumphs of courage and curiosity. Little attention was given to the perspectives of the people encountered on those journeys. Complexity was replaced with clarity. Differences were simplified. The message that remained was that Britain had stepped onto the world stage with purpose, and that purpose was progress. The impact of these lessons reached beyond the classroom. Children carried them home, sharing what they learned at dinner tables. And in conversations with neighbors. Parents who had grown up before the rise of standardized schooling sometimes heard ideas they had never considered. Education created generational difference. The young would grow into adults whose understanding of empire came not from personal experience, but from curated knowledge. The impact of these lessons reached beyond the classroom. Teachers became interpreters of identity. Many believed sincerely in the lessons they delivered. They saw the empire as a structure that provided opportunity, protection, and advancement. To them, teaching imperial values felt like preparing students for a modern world. Even when they did not speak directly about loyalty or pride, the structure of their lessons implied it. A student who mastered geography had already learned that Britain stood at the center of the map. A student who studied history had already learned that Britain shaped the narrative. Outside the classroom, the Industrial Revolution intensified this process. Factories demanded literacy. Expanding bureaucracy required clerks and record keepers. Global trade created new administrative roles. Schools prepared children for these futures, providing the basic skills needed to serve an empire growing more complex each year. In this sense, education became a supply line. Not of goods, but of people. The influence of schooling reached even further through religious and missionary education. In some regions of the empire, schools modeled after British institutions introduced similar lessons. They taught English, British customs, and administrative systems. For students in these territories, the classroom was a place where identity was negotiated. They learned to operate within new systems while balancing their own traditions. Some embraced the lessons. Others questioned them. Many navigated both worlds at once. Inside Britain, the emotional impact of schooling was quieter but profound. A textbook read every afternoon. A lesson repeated year after year. Children learned to see the empire not as something distant, but as something familiar. As something that existed not only overseas but within themselves. It was not a project. It was part of who they were. Yet even in these early years, hints of contradiction appeared. A few educators introduced ideas that encouraged reflection rather than acceptance. Some students asked questions their textbooks could not answer. How did distant regions view British presence? Did improvement look the same to everyone? These thoughts rarely led to open challenge, but they marked the beginning of awareness. The seeds of doubt were small, but they existed. Still, the dominant tone remained confident. Britannia's classrooms produced a generation ready to inherit the responsibilities of empire. These young people would grow into clerks, officers, merchants, engineers, and teachers of their own. They would carry the lessons of their childhood into workplaces and institutions. Many would never question the structure that shaped their opportunities because they had learned its logic before they ever learned their multiplication tables. By the end of the 1820s, the classroom had become one of the empire's strongest tools. It operated quietly, without armies or decrees. It shaped identity through routine rather than command. Children learned that empire offered purpose, progress, and connection. They learned to see the world through the lens of British influence. And when they grew older, they brought that lens into every decision they made. Between 1800 and 1830, schools did not expand borders. They expanded belief. They taught a generation to see the empire as natural and beneficial. They taught identity as geography. And citizenship as destiny. And long before the empire reached its height, it had already secured a place in the minds of those who would defend it, administer it, or simply accept it as the order of the world. In these classrooms, the empire was not only taught. It was imagined. It was lived. It became something a child could claim as their own. The Victorian century began in 1837 with the coronation of a young queen. And from that moment onward Britain entered an age where identity and empire became intertwined. Queen Victoria's reign stretched across 6 decades, long enough for an entire generation to grow up believing that the empire was not just a political structure, but a defining part of who they were. The empire became a presence in daily life, not through force or decree, but through music, ceremony, architecture, and symbols that surrounded the population like a frame around a portrait. Royal events helped create this sense of belonging. Parades moved through crowded streets, watched by citizens who lined pavements and leaned from windows. Flags waved. Brass bands played. Carriages rolled past, carrying the monarchy that many believed embodied the empire itself. These ceremonies transformed the abstract idea of global power into something emotional and familiar. The public did not simply witness authority. They felt connected to it. The empire became a story they believed they were part of, even if they never left the island where they were born. Grand exhibitions reinforced this connection. The most famous appeared in 1851, when the Great Exhibition opened in London. Inside a vast iron and glass building, artifacts, machines, and materials from across the world were displayed as proof of British progress. Visitors walked through halls filled with objects described as wonders, treasures, or trophies. They saw goods from distant territories and were told they represented improvement, guidance, and civilizing influence. Museums continued this work. Their collections expanded rapidly, filled with objects gathered from expeditions, diplomatic exchanges, and colonial administration. Items that once held cultural or spiritual meaning in their places of origin were placed behind glass, labeled as curiosities or achievements. Visitors moved through galleries and developed a sense of ownership over lands they would never see. The layout of these institutions turned empire into something observable and manageable. It was presented not as domination, but as stewardship. The narrative was elegant, but incomplete. Architecture mirrored these sentiments. Government buildings, railway stations, and public monuments grew taller and more elaborate. Stone arches, towers, and domes suggested permanence and order. Statues of military leaders and administrators claimed public space, reinforcing the idea that empire was natural and honorable. Even the design of city streets reflected expansion. Roads widened, development accelerated, and urban planning became a symbol of national confidence. To walk through a Victorian city was to move through a landscape that announced Britannia's place in the world. At home, literature and newspapers helped shape imagination. Adventure stories described distant territories as places waiting to be discovered or guided. In these stories, British characters stepped into foreign landscapes with ease, as though history moved aside for them. Newspapers spoke of imperial events with admiration, not hesitation. The tone was steady and self-assured. The empire was not treated as a question. It was treated as a fact. The monarchy itself became a symbol of unity. Queen Victoria's image appeared on coins, stamps, portraits, and household items. People carried her likeness with them unconsciously. Her presence linked the everyday world to the imperial world, even in the most ordinary places. Trains, factories, homes, and schools stood beneath her reign. This continuity made the empire feel stable, like a structure that could not be shaken. Meanwhile, overseas, the reality of imperial rule was far more complex. Territories under British administration experienced change that did not always match the narrative heard in Britain. Yet within the Victorian imagination, the empire remained a source of pride. Public opinion depended on distance. The empire became a mirror that reflected confidence back toward its center. Education reinforced this worldview. Children learned that their country stood not only as a nation, but as a guiding force. The empire seemed inevitable. By the late 19th century, this identity had settled deeply into society. Even those who questioned empire often did so from within the narrative it created. Opposition did not necessarily reject the idea of empire. It asked for improvement, reform, or responsibility. The structure itself remained central. Being British meant belonging to something large, organized, and purposeful. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building. Industrial change, political reform, and expansion had created a vast system that demanded constant maintenance. The grandeur of the Victorian era came with cost and contradiction. The empire provided confidence, but it also required justification. It offered identity, but it also overshadowed complexity. When the century drew to a close in 1901, the empire remained powerful. But time had already begun to move. The Victorian age had crystallized identity around imperial certainty. The next century would begin to test it. The era of steam, ceremony, and exhibitions had created the emotional foundation of empire. In the decades that followed, history would ask whether that foundation could endure. The Victorian century was not only a period of royal rule. It was the moment when empire became part of national personality. A symbol woven into architecture, art, public memory, and everyday life. And when that definition eventually changed, the echo of the Victorian age remained. Suspended like a memory of grandeur that no longer matched the world it helped create. Newspapers and the Empire lens 1850 to 1900. Between 1850 and 1900, most Britons understood the empire not through travel or personal experience, but through the printed page. Newspapers became the lens through which the world was seen, interpreted, and judged. Headlines carried news from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean as if they were chapters of a single story centered on Britain. Readers learned to imagine distant territories not as independent places with their own histories, but as settings in which Britain acted, commanded, and decided. In ink and illustration, the press became a storyteller that shaped identity more powerfully than any monument or map. Every morning, the rhythm of empire unfolded in print. Delivery boys tossed rolled papers onto stoops in industrial cities. In rural villages, a single paper passed between families, its pages softening under repeated hands. Coffeehouse counters filled with men reading aloud to those who could not read for themselves. The empire became a shared experience, even for those who never left home. But what they shared was filtered. It was not reality. It was interpretation. Newspapers framed events overseas as signs of progress and responsibility. Reports emphasized British leadership, technological innovation, and governmental reform. Railways built abroad were described as gifts of improvement. Administrators establishing new laws were presented as symbols of order. The narrative implied that expansion was not a matter of dominance, but of guidance. It encouraged readers to believe that Britain was shaping the world for the better. Resistance, when mentioned, appeared only in fragments. Protests, disputes, or uprisings were summarized in brief paragraphs that framed resistance as disorder, chaos, or misunderstanding. Very rarely did articles explore the causes of unrest or the perspectives of the people involved. Instead, conflict was described as something to be corrected. The empire, in the language of the newspapers, was the answer to the problem rather than its cause. Silence became a tool as effective as any headline. What was not printed shaped belief as much as what was. Illustrated papers expanded this influence. Sketches showed parades in colonial capitals. Soldiers marching through palm-lined streets. Or governors seated in ceremonial halls. These images made distant places feel accessible. But they also simplified them. Complex societies became stages where British figures stood at the center. The rich detail of local life remained outside the frame. Through repetition, the illustrated press taught readers what empire looked like. Even if that vision was incomplete. News from Asia carried a tone of administrative direction. Reports from India, Hong Kong, or Malaya described policy as if it were instruction rather than negotiation. Articles suggested that governance flowed in one direction, from London outward. The idea that local leaders or populations influenced change was rarely acknowledged. The result was not overt persuasion, but quiet shaping. Readers came to believe that events abroad depended on Britain to make sense. Coverage of Africa often focused on exploration. Expeditions were described like heroic quests through unknown territory, even when they crossed regions with established societies and long histories. Names of explorers appeared more frequently than the names of the people they encountered. Maps printed in newspapers showed blank spaces soon to be filled by borders and administrative lines. This framing turned conquest into discovery and presence into inevitability. Reports from the Caribbean blended nostalgia and oversight. They framed the region as a site of trade and transition, a place defined by plantations, ports, and potential. Articles rarely explored how earlier centuries of exploitation shaped the present. Instead, they described the region as though it waited for improvement. Progress meant British policy. Decline meant the absence of it. This perspective did not need to argue. It only needed to imply. In editorial columns, writers tackled questions of national identity. They emphasized duty, competition, and global status. The empire became a point of emotional investment. Pride and fear worked together to support the narrative. If Britain did not lead, they warned, another nation would. Responsibility was framed as obligation. Newspapers taught readers to feel the empire rather than simply know it. Even those who disagreed with policy found themselves shaped by the structure of the conversation. Working-class readers encountered the empire differently. For them, newspapers offered a vision of escape. Recruitment advertisements for the army and navy appeared beside news from overseas. They implied that joining the forces could lift a man from factory work into a world of purpose. Middle-class readers saw the empire as a space of opportunity for commerce and influence. For the wealthy, it reinforced status. In every social layer, the story of empire acted as a mirror, reflecting what people wanted to believe about themselves. By the late 19th century, the empire in newsprint had become a world unto itself. It operated on assumptions that felt natural. It shaped expectations. It filled silence with certainty. The narrative worked because it was familiar. The newspaper page became a boundary between what was real and what was told. People trusted what they read because they could not see what was missing. The narrative worked because it was familiar. As the century approached its end, cracks began to appear. A few journalists questioned the narratives that had gone unquestioned for decades. They wrote about the cost of expansion, the strain on national resources, and the voices that had been left out of the story. They hinted that identity had been built on interpretation rather than truth. Between 1850 and 1900, newspapers did more than report the empire. They created the idea of empire. They turned distant places into recognizable names, complex histories into digestible stories, and global inequality into the backdrop of national pride. The world most Britons knew was not the world itself. It was the world as the press described it. And in that gap between reality and representation, identity was formed. War reshaped the world between 1914 and 1918. When World War I began, the British Empire entered the conflict with the expectation that it could dictate the outcome through command and resources. Instead, the war revealed a new reality. Britain could not stand alone. The empire was no longer just territory on a map or distant administration. It became manpower, supply, and sacrifice. It became something Britain relied on for survival. In this moment of crisis, identity changed, and the empire was forced to see itself differently. Millions of soldiers across the empire answered the call to serve. Canadians traveled across the Atlantic to join the Western Front. Indian regiments marched under the same storms of artillery as British battalions. Australians and New Zealanders fought in campaigns that tested endurance at the edges of the world. African and Caribbean units carried out essential labor, logistics, and frontline support roles that kept the war machine moving. The empire arrived in Europe as living presence rather than distant idea. For the first time, people from across continents stood in the same mud, fought on the same fields, and faced the same dangers. Training camps became places where accents, languages, and traditions mixed. Soldiers who had never met someone from another part of the empire suddenly found themselves eating in the same mess halls, waiting for the same orders, preparing for the same battles. These encounters built a kind of shared understanding. Identity was no longer just British or colonial. It became collective. Bound by uniforms and circumstance, men learned to see each other as part of the same story, even when their lives at home were separated by oceans. On the Western Front, the realities of conflict created a unity that politics had never fully achieved. Battles stretched across landscapes broken by trenches and wire. The environment shaped experience as much as strategy. The roar of artillery, the press of rain against helmets, the thick mud that pulled at boots all became part of a memory shared by millions. These conditions did not erase difference. They revealed it, tested it, and forced men to rely on one another despite it. Identity moved from assumption to necessity. Behind the lines, medical stations brought another form of shared sacrifice. Wounded soldiers from many regions were treated side by side. They waited for transport, rest, or recovery in tents and makeshift wards. Nurses and doctors worked under pressure that challenged every resource they had. Here too, the empire became visible. Not as a map, but as lives trying to endure. The cost of war did not discriminate between accents or origins. The consequences were shared because the danger was shared. Back home, families felt the war in their own way. Letters arrived from the front, each one connecting distant landscapes with kitchens and workshop tables. Communities in Britain learned the names of unfamiliar places because loved ones were stationed there. Communities across the empire learned the names of European towns they had never expected to know. The war linked households that would never meet. In this connection, the empire became emotional rather than administrative. It became personal. Governments realized the significance of this transformation. Britain issued appeals for support that acknowledged its dependence on imperial strength. Supplies, food, and material flowed in from across the world. Shipping lanes became arteries of survival. The empire could no longer be described as an extension of Britain. It was the structure holding Britain up. This dependence challenged older ideas of one-sided control. The war forced recognition that power could not be separated from partnership, even if that partnership was uneven. At the same time, the experience of service planted new questions in the minds of those who fought. If sacrifice was shared, should authority also be shared? If loyalty crossed borders, should opportunity do the same? Soldiers returned home with memories of commitment and hardship. The experience of facing danger for a nation reshaped how many understood their place within it. This tension became the beginning of a shift that would outlast the conflict. As casualty lists grew, national pride took on a heavier weight. The language of honor and duty held a new gravity because it was paid for with real lives Britain began to remember. The war not only as a struggle for victory, but as a moment in. Ceremonies and memorials attempted to acknowledge this reality they became places of collective mourning, where the empire's sacrifice could not. By 1918, the world that entered the war had changed. Victory did not erase the cost or return the world to the way it had been. Instead, it left questions that demanded answers. The empire had proven its value in ways that challenged the old assumptions of power. Shared sacrifice created expectations for recognition, respect, and representation. The idea of identity expanded again, not through ambition but through experience. Looking back, the war showed that global power does not remain distant. It travels with those who serve. It settles in the lives of those who sacrifice. It returns home and reshapes how a nation sees itself. Between 1914 and 1918, empire shifted from something Britain controlled to something Britain depended on. The cost of survival became collective. War created a new kind of identity, built on endurance rather than confidence. It was shared, even when uneven. It was earned, even when unacknowledged. The future would struggle to reconcile these truths. But the memory of that shared sacrifice would continue to speak long after the guns fell silent. When the First World War ended in 1918, Britain celebrated peace. But the peace that followed did not bring certainty. Instead, it revealed the beginning of a fracture in the identity that empire had created. The confidence that once felt natural began to feel unsettled. Across the empire, independence movements emerged with new determination. Protests, petitions, strikes, and negotiations formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as isolated unrest. The early 20th century became a period when the story Britain told about itself no longer matched the story the world was telling in return. News traveled back to British homes in newspaper columns, radio broadcasts, and letters from overseas administrators. Reports described protests in India, where crowds demanded representation and self-rule. They described unrest in Africa, where new political groups questioned tax policies and labor systems. They described negotiations in the Middle East, where shifting promises and wartime agreements produced uncertainty. These stories reached breakfast tables alongside teacups and morning bread. They entered classrooms, workplaces, and coffeehouses. For the first time, ordinary Britons faced a version of empire that did not resemble the one they had grown up believing in. The older narrative had promised progress. It said the empire was a force for improvement, education, and connection. It claimed that British governance offered stability. But if the empire truly represented progress, why did so many demand freedom from it? If British authority protected prosperity, why were so many asking to escape it? These questions did not arrive all at once, but they grew with each headline. They formed a quiet challenge to identity itself. In the 1920s, demonstrations in India expanded. Marchers filled streets demanding the right to govern themselves. British readers saw photographs of crowds unlike any they had seen before. These images did not show distant subjects waiting for direction. They showed organized movements, disciplined and confident. The idea that colonies lacked political agency no longer fit the evidence. The mirror that once reflected reassurance now showed a different image. Across Africa, labor strikes and political organizations challenged colonial authority. Workers refused unfair terms, and communities resisted new policies. In West and East Africa alike, the idea of obedience to empire no longer held unquestioned authority. British newspapers attempted to explain these events with softened language, describing unrest as confusion or misunderstanding. But even softened truth carried enough power to raise doubt. Readers learned that the empire was no longer accepted without resistance. In the Middle East, the situation was more complex. Wartime promises collided with post-war administration. Agreements made during the conflict did not align with decisions afterward. Local leaders demanded clarity and control over their futures. Negotiations moved slowly, while frustration moved quickly. British citizens observing from afar recognized the uncertainty. The empire no longer appeared as a unified project. It appeared as a puzzle with pieces that no longer fit. As the world changed, identity inside Britain shifted. The pride that once felt effortless required explanation. Some clung to older beliefs, insisting that unrest proved the need for continued authority. Others began to look inward, questioning whether the values they associated with Britain matched the actions taken in its name. Doubt did not replace pride entirely, but it stood beside it, creating tension that did not disappear. In parlors and public houses, conversations reflected this change. Where certainty had once lived, hesitation entered. People spoke of the empire with a tone shaped less by celebration and more by concern. They wondered what the future might bring if demands for independence continued to grow. They wondered how long a system built on distant control could survive in a century that expected representation and voice. Education struggled to adapt. Textbooks still praised exploration and administration. But teachers faced questions their lessons did not fully answer. Students asked why people overseas protested if the empire existed for their benefit. They asked why promises of reform always seemed delayed. Teachers responded with caution, aware that the past no longer offered simple comfort. The mirror of imperial identity had begun to crack. Cultural life reflected the shift as well. Writers and artists explored themes of uncertainty, responsibility, and change. Some works celebrated the old pride, while others questioned it. Plays and essays portrayed the empire not as an unquestioned triumph, but as a complicated inheritance. Museums filled with artifacts began to feel different. Objects taken from overseas no longer seemed like trophies of achievement. They began to look like reminders of unfinished conversations. By the 1930s, the cracks had widened. The Great Depression strained economies and made the cost of maintaining empire more visible. Political groups across the world spoke openly about liberation rather than reform. Inside Britain, citizens who once accepted empire as natural began to see it as temporary. The assumption of permanence faded. The identity built on global dominance no longer felt inevitable. By the 1930s, the cracks had widened. The Great Depression strained economies and made the cost of maintaining empire more visible. Political groups across the world spoke openly about liberation rather than reform. Inside Britain, citizens who once accepted empire as natural began to see it as temporary. The assumption of permanence faded. The identity built on global dominance no longer felt inevitable. And yet, the story did not collapse. Pride remained. Many still believed the empire represented purpose and stability. But that belief existed alongside awareness that things were changing. It reflected both the past and the growing uncertainty of the future. By 1939, when a new war approached, Britain stood at a crossroads. The empire still stretched across continents, but its foundations were no longer unquestioned. The world outside demanded choice. The world inside demanded clarity. The idea of destiny that once guided national confidence no longer carried the same weight. Identity rested on history. But the future required something else. Between 1919 and 1939, Britain learned that power did not guarantee permanence. It learned that pride could exist beside doubt. It learned that an empire built across oceans could be challenged by voices that refused silence. The mirror that once reflected victory now showed the cost of maintaining an image that no longer matched the world. The cracks did not destroy the mirror. They revealed it. World War II and the Shattering Illusion 1939 to 1945. When the Second World War began in 1939, the British Empire once again prepared to fight as a global force. Memories of the previous war still lived in families and communities. The empire had survived before, and many believed it would survive again. There was a familiar confidence in the air, a belief that despite hardship and sacrifice, the empire would endure. But beneath that confidence, the world was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. The war that followed would not only challenge Britannia's strength. It would challenge the very identity of the empire itself. In the early stages of the conflict, the empire stood together much as it had in 1914. Soldiers from India, Africa, the Caribbean, and Dominion nations answered the call once more. Supply routes stretched across oceans. Radio broadcasts described the unity of the imperial world, presenting it as a shield against danger. For a moment, it seemed as if the structure that had held for generations might remain unbroken. Then, in 1942, the illusion shattered. The fall of Singapore became the moment that defined a turning point. For decades, Singapore had been described as an impenetrable fortress, the eastern pillar of imperial security. Newspapers and officials had spoken of it with certainty. It was meant to symbolize British strength, strategy, and authority. When it fell to Japanese forces, the event traveled through the empire like a shockwave. The myth of invincibility collapsed in an instant. Japan's rapid victories across Asia revealed a truth the empire had avoided confronting. Britain could be defeated. Britain could lose territory. Britain could fail to protect the lands it once promised to defend. In places like Malaya, Burma, and Hong Kong, the rapid advance of Japanese forces forced people to re-examine their belief in imperial power. In India, where demands for independence had grown steadily for years, the fall of Singapore became evidence that Britain no longer held the world as firmly as it once had. The psychological impact was as powerful as the military one. Colonial soldiers again fought beside British forces, but the context had changed. Their service was no longer seen as a quiet assumption. It was now a statement, and with it came expectation. If the empire depended on their loyalty, then loyalty required recognition. If millions risked their lives for the empire, then the empire owed them more than medals and speeches. The questions that had quietly formed after the First World War became louder. They demanded answers, not reassurance. In Britain itself, the wartime experience changed how ordinary people saw the empire. Air raids brought destruction to London, Coventry, Liverpool, and countless other cities. Food rationing, evacuation, and shared hardship blurred the old lines of class and privilege. A nation fighting for survival could no longer imagine itself as a nation ruling the world. The identity of empire began to loosen. Something else began to form in its place. Across the empire, independence movements accelerated. In Africa and the Caribbean, new organizations emerged with clearer goals and stronger voices. In the Middle East and Southeast Asia, negotiations became urgent. People who had once been described as subjects began to see themselves as citizens. The war had altered more than borders and armies. It had altered imagination. Britain, too, began to imagine a different future. The desire to rebuild at home grew stronger than the desire to maintain dominance abroad. The war demanded attention, resources, and focus. As the conflict continued, the empire shifted from something celebrated to something questioned. It was not yet collapsing, but it was bending. The confidence that once defined it had softened into uncertainty. By 1945, the world that existed before the war no longer felt real. Victory did not restore the illusion of strength. It revealed how fragile that illusion had been. Britain remained standing, but no longer stood above the world in the same way. The empire was still vast, but it no longer felt permanent. It relied on negotiation, diplomacy, and consent in ways it never had before. The age of command had begun to fade, replaced by an age of conversation and consequence. For colonial soldiers returning home, the future looked different from the world they had left. They had fought under the same flag as British troops. They had faced the same dangers. They had survived bombardments, jungles, deserts, and seas. They had seen modern war and modern politics side by side. They returned not as subjects waiting to be governed, but as individuals ready to be heard. Their service did not weaken imperial loyalty. It redefined it. At home, Britain had changed as well. The Blitz had broken the belief that war happened somewhere else. The ration book had changed how people thought about fairness. Shared suffering built unity within the nation but weakened the idea of unity with an empire stretched across the world. The question of identity shifted from what Britain ruled to what Britain was. Not an imperial power. A nation among nations. Between 1939 and 1945, the empire experienced a transformation deeper than any battle could show. The fall of Singapore was not the end of the empire. It was the end of the story the empire had told about itself. The story of certainty. The story of permanence. The story of unbroken strength. What replaced it was not failure, but awareness. Awareness that power could be challenged. Awareness that loyalty carried expectations. Awareness that identity could exist without empire. When the war ended, the illusion did not return. It had been shattered, not by defeat alone, but by the realization shared across continents. The empire was no longer the center of the world. It was becoming part of a world that no longer needed it. Between 1947 and 1950, Britain entered a moment that felt like waking from a long dream. For generations, maps, museums, and childhood lessons had framed the empire as part of national identity. To be British was to belong to something vast, powerful, and connected to distant horizons. But when India gained independence in 1947, the story that had defined the country for more than a century began to falter. What followed was more than political transition. It was the end of an emotional era. In the summer of 1947, newspapers reported the event as history in motion. Headlines described ceremonies, borders, and new governments forming. For many, the feeling was difficult to describe. The center of gravity that had once held steady began to move. The empire had been presented as permanent. The loss of India suggested it was not. Within months, discussions about the future spread through parliament, universities, and working-class streets. Some argued that the change had been inevitable, the result of global pressure and historical momentum. Others insisted that Britain could adapt, forming new partnerships rather than ruling through command. But beneath these arguments was a deeper question, unspoken yet widely felt. If empire no longer shaped national identity, what would replace it? For those who had served overseas, the shift felt personal. Veterans who had once marched under the imperial flag now returned to a country still rebuilding from war. They searched for work, stability, and purpose. They remembered ports and cities where Britain had once seemed unchallengeable. Now those memories belonged to a world that no longer existed. For younger generations, the change arrived in the form of silence. The stories told in schoolrooms did not match the headlines. Lessons that once displayed maps heavy with red markings now seemed like echoes from another lifetime. In public speech and private conversation, attitudes toward empire diverged. Some still believed in its legacy, describing it as an era of guidance, connection, or responsibility. Others saw it as a burden that Britain could no longer afford, a system held together by resources that no longer existed. Both views appeared side by side, reflecting a society unsure of its own reflection. Confidence and doubt moved through daily life like two shadows cast by the same figure. Economically, the country faced challenges that made the transition unavoidable. Rationing continued. Reconstruction demanded funding. Domestic priorities overtook overseas ambition. The empire had once been seen as a source of financial security. Now it represented responsibility in a world that required new strategies. Britain turned toward Europe, the Commonwealth, and international partnerships. The future would not look like the past, but the shape of what came next remained unclear. By 1948 and 1949, more territories moved toward constitutional change. Independence discussions spread. The idea that Britain controlled a global network dissolved into the reality that it now needed to negotiate with former colonies as equals. This was not defeat. It was adjustment. Yet the emotional impact could not be softened by diplomacy. For many, the shift felt like losing a part of the national story. The monarchy remained a symbol of continuity. Royal ceremonies continued. But their meaning changed. No longer celebrations of imperial reach. They became demonstrations of shared identity within a shrinking world. The map around the crown had altered. The crown itself did not. This continuity helped some citizens navigate the transition, offering familiarity as the world rearranges itself. Meanwhile, younger generations began forming identities untethered from empire. They grew up in a Britain focused on social reform, technology, and rebuilding. They reached adulthood without the assumption that the empire defined their lives. They asked different questions than their parents had. They measured success differently. They spoke of opportunity at home rather than authority abroad. By 1950, the emotional landscape of the country had changed. The empire still existed in fragments, but its meaning had thinned. It no longer dictated Britannia's place in the world. It no longer shaped the imagination in the way it once had. The people who looked toward the future saw a nation searching for a new identity. Some found comfort in continuity. Others embraced reinvention. The end of an era is rarely recognized in a single moment. It becomes visible only when looking back. Between 1947 and 1950, Britain crossed that threshold. The empire that had shaped the Victorian century, fueled the industrial age, and framed national pride entered a final phase of transition. It did not disappear. It changed shape until the old definition no longer applied. In the quiet spaces between political events, something more human occurred. People reconsidered their understanding of belonging. The question that emerged did not demand immediate answers. It asked for time. Who are we without empire? The country would spend decades searching for that answer, not as a loss, but as an evolution. The end of the empire was not the end of Britain. It was the beginning of whatever came next. By 1950, Britain existed in a space between what it had been and what it would become. The empire that once defined its presence on the world stage no longer held the same power. Independence movements had reshaped borders and redrawn relationships. The age of imperial certainty had passed. Yet something remained. Not territory or command, but identity. The nation walked forward carrying pieces of the past, sometimes with pride, sometimes with discomfort. In everyday life, reminders of empire appeared without announcement. Schoolchildren learned geography from textbooks that still referenced former colonies. Maps on classroom walls showed borders that had shifted, yet the lessons struggled to catch up. Language carried fragments of history in idioms and expressions that no one questioned. Museums preserved artifacts that told stories without always explaining how those stories began. None of these things declared imperial identity. They simply sustained it. Public spaces held the architecture of memory. Statues in city squares depicted figures whose influence had stretched across oceans. Street names honored places and people tied to the imperial past. Buildings constructed during the height of empire continued to serve as banks, municipal offices, and universities. Their stone entrances and towering facades spoke of confidence formed in another era. They remained as witnesses, unchanged while the world around them transformed. For many Britons, the end of empire stirred nostalgia. They remembered celebrations, ceremonies, and newspaper headlines that had once described Britain as a guiding hand in the world. Some spoke of the empire as a time of stability and certainty, when national identity felt unshaken. They did not ignore the changes that had come. They simply held on to the parts of the past that felt reassuring. In their minds, the empire became a memory shaped by sentiment rather than complexity. Others looked back with criticism. They questioned the foundations on which power had been built. They considered the cost at which influence had been achieved. They read accounts from newly independent nations and recognized the distance between imperial narrative and reality. Their reflection did not seek to erase history, but to understand it. They believed that identity could not move forward without acknowledging the full weight of the past. For them, memory demanded responsibility rather than celebration. Most people found themselves somewhere between these two positions. They accepted that the empire had shaped Britain. But they also recognized that the future required something different. They understood that identity did not disappear when authority did. It changed shape. It adapted. It became a story to be examined rather than defended. In this middle ground, the legacy of empire did not exist as a single conclusion. It existed as a set of questions. Nationwide, institutions adjusted to this transition. Universities expanded their fields of study to include histories that had been overlooked. Diplomats formed new partnerships based on negotiation rather than command. Trade shifted from guaranteed imperial routes to uncertain global markets. Britain learned to operate alongside former colonies rather than above them. Each change made the past feel more distant, even as it remained present. As it remained present. In private homes, the legacy appeared in quieter ways. Families stored heirlooms brought back by ancestors who had served or worked overseas. Letters written decades earlier remained tucked inside drawers, carrying voices from a world that no longer existed. Photographs showed uniforms, ships, or foreign landscapes. These memories did not speak with clarity. They spoke with fragments. They were reminders that personal experience and national history often move together, even when they pull in different directions. The idea of Britishness itself evolved. Identity was no longer anchored in empire. It was anchored in recovery, reconstruction, and the effort to define a place in the post-war world. Culture began to reflect this shift. Literature, art, and film explored themes of loss, transition, and uncertainty. Stories focused on ordinary lives rather than imperial achievement. The narrative of greatness gave way to the narrative of endurance. Immigration added new voices to this identity. People from former colonies traveled to Britain seeking work, education, or new beginnings. They arrived not as subjects, but as participants in the nation's future. Their presence challenged the idea that empire had been something Britain bestowed upon others. It revealed how interconnected those histories truly were. The empire had shaped them, but they would help reshape Britain. Through them, the legacy of empire became a living influence rather than a distant memory. By 1950, the empire no longer defined Britannia's place in the world. But it remained part of how Britain understood itself. The legacy lived in pride and regret, in confidence and uncertainty. In memory and debate. The past had left shadows, but also signposts. What mattered now was how the nation chose to interpret them. Identity after empire did not arrive fully formed. It emerged slowly, in parliament and press. In schools and streets. In private conversations and public decisions. It grew from the acceptance that the future could not be built on foundations that no longer existed. It required both acknowledgement and imagination. It required the willingness to see history not just as achievement, but as consequence. By the middle of the 20th century, Britain was beginning to understand that the end of empire was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The empire had shaped identity. Identity would now shape the future. The empire shaped Britain not just on maps, but in minds and beliefs. It built confidence and purpose, but also left questions that still echo in the present. Empires end. Identities remain. And history helps us understand the bridge between them. Thank you for traveling through history today. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep learning from the past.